All right, fantastic. Well, thank you all so much for coming. My name is Dr. Angela Parker. I've been with Jenesse Center for 17 years. I'm the director of trainings and programs, which just basically means I'm responsible for like outreach and education. We have a program called Generation J, which I'll talk a little bit about later, where we work with elementary school, high school, and college and university students around issues of self-identity, self-empowerment, and healthy relationships. So I'm glad to see everybody, and I hope that you enjoy our presentation.
I'm gonna pass this around. Don't forget to talk.
Oh, I think I can catch it.
I don't know how well it's catching us, but if you cannot hear us online, please tell us. I'm looking at the computer like I can see them. But I am Jennifer Haddad Bell. Thank you for bearing with us. Thanks for doing the introductions while we were waiting. It's a lot to coordinate with people in person and virtual people. So thank you for bearing with us. I just need to like take a deep breath for a second because I've been coordinating a lot of this stuff, and this is my first time in 3 years actually doing a breakout while coordinating. So thank you for being here and being a part of this with us. I am a program consultant with the Jenesse Center and with Futures Without Violence. Jenesse Center, well, Angela told you a little bit about Jenesse Center, Futures Without Violence. If you're not familiar, they're a national, I'm going to say training and technical assistance organization. They do not provide direct services, but they work with all of your types of organizations. And we're going to be going through some resources, which you do see on the table. They're the ones that put these out and develop them. And they do a whole bunch of work. So I'm not going to get into everything they do, but you can check them out online, and we'll share some of their resources a little bit later. So thank you again for being here. You got that? Okay. I think we're both pretty informal, so we want this to be as interactive and useful to you as possible. So please stop us if you have questions. Same thing with those of you online. Please use the chat to type any questions you want to ask. I don't like just talking and like having no exchange.
I not want to hear us for hours and a half.
Maybe they do. Okay, so some of our goals for you today are one, to be able to identify 3 physical and behavioral health consequences of adolescent relationship abuse, which we used to call teen dating violence, so that we're basically talking about the same thing. You'll be able to explain the connection between relationship abuse and adolescent pregnancy, and implement the steps of the CUES intervention. That's a Futures Without Violence intervention that we'll be talking about in detail. And then you'll be able to also list the evaluation findings, or really the amazing results of implementing CUES specifically in school-based health settings. But CUES, you're all coming from different settings and different types of organizations. CUES can be adapted and implemented in every single one of your programs. So keep that in mind, and we'll try to tailor and adapt the language so that it makes sense for all of your programs. I don't know what the slide numbers are, but I'll just do this and then you can take over. Okay, so the whole day has been about moving beyond silos, and all of our work is grounded in the power of these 2 worlds connecting, right? Health and intimate partner violence, and DV service providers, those 2 worlds. So we want to extend that even more in this conversation, and also talk about the connection between health, violence, and also social services and schools and the education system. They're really all connected, and there's opportunity for prevention, intervention, support in all of these different settings. And there's opportunities to have transformative conversations about safe and healthy relationships, particularly with young people, in all of these settings. So we just want to ground the conversation today in that knowing.
All right, and I'm gonna get up because I'll just make sure I stay. Oh, let me know if I'm off camera. So, am I off camera? How about right here? Okay, fantastic. So I want to go over. Sorry, I think it got. I want to go over some terminology so we know kind of a lot of times like domestic violence is used interchangeably to talk about like intimate partner violence or maybe elder abuse or child abuse or different things that are going on in the home in a domestic setting. So I just wanted to be clear on what we mean when we say different terms. So when we say domestic violence and sexual assault, we refer to it as DSV. Intimate partner violence, IPV. Everybody's heard that phrase, right? Sexual assault, SA. Sex trafficking. We're all familiar with that term, right? And then adolescent relationship abuse, which used to be called teen dating violence, right? So those are kind of the terms that we'll be using during the presentation. All right, so I'm interested to know what you guys know about intimate partner violence. What's physical abuse? Anybody want to throw something out there? When I say physical abuse, what do you think of? Hitting. Okay, hitting. Anything else? Hitting, pushing, right? Punching, choking, anything that you think about when you tend to think about intimate partner violence, right? Or domestic violence. What about emotional abuse? Blackmailing, right? Gaslighting, that's the big one, right? Anybody else? No? Verbal abuse, right? Calling you names, name calling. Right? That's physical abuse. Do you think emotional abuse is as bad as physical abuse or no? Yes. Why? Well, we're not there yet. Yeah, we're not there yet. But why is emotional abuse just as bad? Mm-hmm. 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 Exactly. You got it, right? I might be dating myself, but who remembers that phrase, sticks and stones will make my bones, but words will never hurt me? It's a doggone lie. Like she said, a lot of times the things that happen in emotional abuse, not only do you not forget them, but you'll carry it on when you go to a different relationship. And so that's why you end up repeating the cycle over and over again. What about sexual abuse? What do you think of? Yes, right. Rape is a big one, right? But it's also any type of unwanted touching. And in addition to that, it's if you're forced into a sexual situation that you normally would not do, but you feel like if you don't do, it's going to be some repercussions with the abuser, right? So, for example, it could be something as people think is benign, but it could be something like, let's say your partner is into public displays of affection, but you don't like that. But you let them do it because if they don't, they get mad, right? Or let's say, you have a partner that's a little bit more adventurous in the bedroom, right? And maybe they want to do some things you're not comfortable with. Maybe they want to invite somebody into the bedroom and you do it not because you want to, but because you're scared if you don't do it, they'll leave you or they'll hurt you. Also, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but control of your birth control, refusing to use a condom. And so what happens if they don't let you use birth control and or if they don't use a condom? Pregnancy and STIs, right? Right. And so those are all consequences of sexual abuse. What about digital abuse? Have you guys heard that phrase? What do you guys think of when I say that? Yeah. Oh, Jamonte, this is your time to shine. What is digital abuse? Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yes. No, he's right. So using any type of social media to abuse you, that is incessant texting you all the time to see where you are, creating a fake social media profile so that they can follow you and see what you're doing. I always tell people and I know people don't really use Facebook like that, but there was a time when people would go on Facebook and be like, I'm on the corner of 54th and Crenshaw and I'll be here till 3:00. Right. And so if somebody's stalking you, now they know exactly where you're going to be till 3:00. So I always encourage people, even with Instagram and things like that, to post things after. Like, don't particularly post it in the moment, right? Post it kind of when you put it up afterwards, right? And the thing about like texting that I always want to remind people is in the beginning, like some of this stuff, abusive things seem romantic, right? Oh, they just want to check on me. Oh, they want to talk to me all the time. Oh, they love me so much, right? And it's really not into, and you get into it, that you realize there's a controlling factor to it. What about financial abuse? They don't let you work. Take your money, right? So either they don't let you work, right? Or they're not going to work, right? But you work, and they know on the 15th and on the 30th, your check is coming, and you better give them that check, and they will decide how much, if any of that, you get. What's another form of financial abuse that might affect young people? Manifests with teens is that they're buying your affection, right? Like, if you don't buy me this purse, I'm not going to go out with you, right? If you don't buy me this belt, right, I'm going to withhold emotional, like whatever you want, intimacy, right? So that, or if you do this, I'm going to like make sure you have a place to live, like kids that are unhoused, right? And different things like that. So that's how it tends to manifest in young people. And what about spiritual abuse? Right, cults, yeah. So it's when you use somebody's religion against them, right? You either use what they believe in against them, or you force them to practice, right, what you believe in order to get them under control. So good job, you guys, fantastic.
I just this is for our virtual audience. We're sorry the slides are not sharing for you, but you will get a copy of these afterwards. They'll be archived, and this is for everybody in the room too. But we tried to adjust it so you can kind of see them. But I just want you to know we're not leaving you out, and you will get them after today.
All right, so adolescent abuse works very similar to how it works with an adult, right? Well, it's about what two things is abuse about? Right? Power and control, right? That's basically what it is. Somebody has the power to control another person. That's basically what abuse is. And that's the difference between an abusive relationship and a consensual relationship, right? Because no matter what you may think about somebody else's relationship, as long as the two are grown and they're consenting and they're really okay with it, that's their business, right? But it becomes when someone is being forced to do something that they don't want to do because they're scared of the repercussions. That's when it becomes abusive, right? We talked a lot about the different types of abuse, and it's important to understand that the cycle worsens over time, right? You remember how I talked about how a lot of the things that manifest itself with domestic violence start off as romantic? That's why people don't recognize it when it's happening. Like, the thing that like people always ask me is like, I don't know how they didn't know. Like, how couldn't they have seen it? Like, it's really obvious. No, it's not. Abusers are the most charming people that you've ever met in your life. They didn't charm you. They didn't charm your mama. They didn't charm your friends. As a matter of fact, sometimes when you go tell like your friend, oh, Robbie hit me. Oh no, not Robbie. Robbie is so nice, right? Because you thought that up until now, Robbie was the best thing that ever happened to you, like the answer to your prayers, like the man or woman of your dreams, right? And so that's the thing. They gaslight you, right? They will love bomb you, right? All those things to make you think, right, that everything that they're doing is love. And it feels like love, right? Until it doesn't, right? So. All right. So now we have some statistics. Okay. 1 in 5, that's 20% of US teens, girls, report that they've experienced some type of sexual or physical violence. What do we think about this statistic? Any thoughts on it? Mm-hmm. Right, exactly, right. We can guess, if not everybody reports, we can guess that this statistic is way, way, way higher. And for boys, self-identified males, it's about 1 in 7, right? And again, we can deduce, right, that it's most likely higher than what it is that they're saying. Okay. Okay, let's see. All right, so among U.S. high school students dating for 12 months, 1 in 12 experience physical dating violence, and 1 in 12 experience sexual dating violence. Why do you think that is? Why do you think the fastest growing population of those who are victims of domestic violence are youth and adolescents? And there's no wrong answer, just he really likes you, right? So we correlate love and violence, right, without meaning to, right? It's also normalized, right? If you listen to music, YouTube, whatever. And like, I was never one of those people that blamed like the media, right? But there's a correlation to it. And if you don't have positive role models in real life that are example of healthy relationships, stuff, and you're like, oh, that's just how love is, right? And so it teaches you not to demand respect, right? It teaches you that abuse is okay, right? And not only that, when you're coming to talk to the youth and you're like, he or she shouldn't treat you like that, they're looking at you like you're crazy because they have come to believe that that is what love is. All right, each year, at least 400,000 US adolescents experience serious physical or sexual violence, and 48% of high school and middle school students experience sexual harassment. I want to talk a little bit about this middle school and elementary school situation because a lot of times we're in denial, right? That what's going on in middle school and elementary school. Oh, they're too young. Oh, they're not, they just have a little friend, right? Nothing's going on. Meanwhile, they think they're going to get married to this person, right? And they're doing some things that maybe, we don't know that it is that they're doing, or they are in an abusive relationship and we don't recognize it because we don't acknowledge it, right? Oh, they have a little boyfriend or girlfriend. It doesn't really mean anything. I don't even want to talk about it. It doesn't matter, right? So that's important to understand as well. Also, I did a session on when I first started doing this job. I went into an elementary school and I was like, oh, the kids are so young and they don't know what domestic violence is. So I'm going to talk about bullying and respect and it's going to be great. And so I do my little shtick, right? And then afterwards, hands go up, question after question about domestic violence, right? And so that's how I knew, right? They're really seeing this, right? They're seeing it at home and they're experiencing it at school in the form of bullying, right? Or some type of unwanted sexual touching. I'm sorry, I think our thing is lagging. All right, so violence is gendered, but affects young people of all genders, right? So I want to point this out because as you guys know, youth don't see gender the way we may have seen gender growing up. And so, it's important that when we talk to them, we understand that they may not identify as male, they may not identify as female, they might, have no gender, right? They might be non-binary and different things like that. So I just always want to remind people when we have this conversation. However, people who identify as girls are more likely to be victims of physical abuse, but boys are more likely to be victims of psychological abuse. Why do you think that is?
There's a lot of things when you're growing up, you're trying to always reevaluate who you are.
Mhm.
You're always comparing yourself to others. If you don't seem to measure up right now, you feel as if you're missing or lacking something. And those things get to you. It's psychological. I mean, you go to bed with every night, you wake up with every morning, almost like the emotional scars. They don't heal as quickly as the physical ones. And even if they do heal, you still carry it. It doesn't just go away.
Yeah, he's right. That's part of the mutual aggression, right? Being so common. So like for girls might not hit you, right? But they might get in your face, right? They might put their finger in your face. They might raise their voice. You know what I mean? They might degrade you and different things like that. We don't typically call that out as abuse, right? But it is abuse, right? And that's what a lot of men who are victims of domestic violence face: the constant degrading, the constant emotional abuse that just wears them down. And it starts at a young age. All right. Youth involved in same-sex dating are just as likely to experience dating violence. And we know this, right? As those in the opposite sex, right? The statistics are still the same. What's a form of abuse or threats in same-sex relationships that heterosexual cisgendered couples may not face? Exactly, right? So if you leave me, I'm going to tell everybody that you're gay, right? And you may think, oh, this is 2022. Nobody cares. No, people still care, right? And so that's important to understand that. All right, so technology, we talked a little bit about technology. So in the ways that it's used to abuse people, it rarely happens in isolation. So a lot of times if a person is being bullied online, it's through a network of friends, right? It's one of those things where you hear like so-and-so killed themselves, right? And it's because they've been bullied online, right? Maybe a picture got out or people were writing things, right, underneath their profiles that was really making them feel like they are worthless, right? Tearing down their self-esteem, emotional abuse. 1 in 4 teens in relationships report being harassed via phone or text message. She talked a little bit about that, but again, the constant calling, right? The constant, what are you doing? When you get there, you better FaceTime me so I can see where you're at, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you can, stick them on something and not have the other person know whatsoever. So you have to be savvy. Yep. Exactly. So before it used to be GPS, right? People used to be able to put GPSs on their phone, and people got wise to that, right? So of course, some smart person came up with these tags, and also not only can the tags go on your phone, they can go in your car as well, right? Mm-hmm. 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 And again, that's okay if that's what you have mutually decided as a couple, but it's when the other person is forcing you to do it because they want to keep tabs on you, or you have to have my password, but I can't have yours, right? That becomes an issue, right? All right. 84% who report cyber abuse said they were also psychologically abused by their partners, right? That makes sense when you think about it, right? 52% say they were physically abused, because that goes with it, right? Trying to control somebody. And then 33% say they're sexually coerced. What's one way that you can think of that youth and adolescents can be sexually coerced through technology? Mm-hmm. Just send me a picture, nobody's gonna know. It's just between me and you, right? And maybe you don't want to send it, but you might feel like you're the only person that's not doing it. Or they might tell you, oh, don't you trust me? Don't you love me? Kind of things. And then what can happen if things go wrong? They share it, right? And so in the state of California, even if you are both minors, it's considered to be child pornography. So I always tell youth, don't do it just because I'm saying it. You don't want to do it because it's the law, right? And don't be 18 and your partner 17, right? Because now it's possible that you can go to jail for statutory rape, right? So I always say when it comes to sexting, just say no.
There are way too many stories and cases of young people, mostly girls, where this happens, and a few months later, 6 months later, a year later, the repercussions on their life in all areas of their life is so horrific that they take their lives. And if you're not familiar with how common that actually is, I encourage you to look into that. And specifically, there's a documentary called Daisy. What is it, Jen? Do you remember? Daisy, Audrey and Daisy. And it's a story of 2 young girls. Their parents helped make the videos, and you see the unraveling that happens after, photos are shared, publicly or just at school or whatever. So definitely look into that. It just gives you a deeper sense of how horrific it actually is, how detrimental it can be.
All right. And what makes kids vulnerable, youth and adolescents vulnerable to abuse? Again, we talked about that, right? Exposure to abuse in the home where it becomes normalized. Being young, because you know nothing about relationships. Like when you're young, you think you know everything and you don't. Everything you know is because you've seen somebody else do it, right? And so you end up mirroring that, right? Or somebody's telling you what is important. And then substance abuse or, alcoholism and different things like that will make you kind of open and susceptible kind of to that. Can you have consensual sex if you're drunk? If you're both drunk, can you have consensual sex? But they're both drunk though. Okay, no, right? Nobody who is inebriated or under the influence of anything can consent to a sexual relationship, right? Even if you're both drunk, that's not going to be an excuse if the other person says that you raped them, right? So it's important to understand that as well. All right, health impacts. All right, so we're gonna hand the mic over.
Yeah, and we have like 40 minutes, so we're gonna have to speed through some of the pieces. But how many of you are familiar with the health impacts of violence for all people, all ages? Is this a new concept, or are some of you like you're pretty familiar? You're aware of the impacts. I'm just seeing some nods. I don't really know what that means. A little familiar. So we know intimate partner violence is a public health issue. And there are vast health impacts and health consequences that could be short-term and long-term. And there's tons of them documented. I always like to point out, as we're talking about the specific health impacts, how interconnected those impacts actually are, because one actually can make another health impact worsen over time. And it's the same thing when we talk about intervention and supporting people through it and helping them to improve these health impacts. If we can work on one of the core symptoms or issues that's happening because of violence and toxic stress and trauma, you might also be helping them with some of the others. So that will make a little more sense when we see some of the health impacts. But we know that this is very widespread, and it's a really, really important public health issue. That's why we spend so much time putting these types of events together to bring light to that. And the impacts are on general health, they're on mental and behavioral health, and they're also on sexual and reproductive health. Can you do that when I do this? Okay. So here's a kind of a running list of general health impacts. The biggest that we see with just about everybody who's experiencing some form of violence and abuse is anxiety and depression. And that's probably something you hear every day from the people that you're working with. And it's something that adolescents and young people are already experiencing, even when they're not experiencing violence and abuse in their relationship. So it is magnified when they're experiencing violence and abuse. PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse, which I'm going to talk a little bit more in a second, disordered eating. So this can be all eating disorders on the spectrum. And with that, just kind of having, general disconnection from the body, lack of love and respect from the body. If the body is constantly degraded and undermined and not valued, it tends to get internalized for a lot of people, and they're not connected to it, and it shows up in a lot of different behaviors, eating, sexual experiences. I mean, you name it, it's connected to all of it. Suicidality or having thoughts of committing suicide, sleep problems. So that again can be across the spectrum, whether it's insomnia or sleeping too much and experiencing chronic fatigue. Asthma is another one that's been documented for young people. Bladder infections, chronic pain, and there's a lot of different components when we talk about chronic pain. Headaches and migraines is another big one. the spectrum across gastrointestinal problems as well. So, you know, it can be as mild as I just always have a stomach ache to irritable bowel syndrome, or some of the more severe digestive disorders. Cardiovascular issues is another one. And what we know specifically with adults is that adults who experience violence and abuse are much more likely to experience heart attack and stroke and heart disease over the course of their life. And then it's also connected to unintended pregnancies. And why do you think that is?
What else? What did we talk about earlier?
Right, power and control over access to birth control or proper use of birth control, which we'll also talk about. Abnormal, another one. Why do you think that is? Yeah. HPV is begin with. What is it looking for? Yes, thank you for saying that, because a lot of people say STDs, yeast infections. A pap test specifically is to screen for cervical cancer, and it's a prevention. It's a way of helping to prevent cervical cancer when you do them routinely and as recommended for your age and your medical history. So people who are experiencing violence and abuse are at much higher risk of STDs, or sexually transmitted infections, one of which being HPV, and HPV is highly linked to cervical cancer. So that's where that connection comes in. Pelvic pain and PID, or pelvic inflammatory disease, are other health impacts. These are the reproductive health impacts, obviously. And this could be from having a sexually transmitted infection that maybe has gone unnoticed and untreated for a really long time, specifically chlamydia and gonorrhea. It could be, you know, it's also energetic, and it's just that chronic pain that people experience because of the trauma and the toxic stress and living in fear and all of those sort of intangible things that we are experiencing, how it's affecting us physically. You know, I always talk about the mind and the body are so connected, and what we're experiencing in the mind does eventually play out in our bodies in some way. And we talked about STIs and HIV. And then for those that do experience pregnancy, low birth weight, poor birth outcomes, or maybe poor pregnancy outcomes as well. So there's a whole host here. So can you kind of connect the dots with some of these health impacts? There's a ton more, but these are just calling out some of the big ones that are specifically affecting young people. We know that, you know, sleep problems, chronic fatigue, and chronic pain tend to be very connected to the experience of depression, right? We also know hypertension or high blood pressure can be kind of linked to anxiety, right? So that's just drawing on some of the connections, but when we can help intervene at least one of these complaints that somebody is experiencing, over time, it can help with the others. Sometimes just helping with their nutrition and hydration, that alone has a huge impact on supporting some of these other experiences that they're having. Are there any questions so far about any of the health impacts, or anybody from online? Okay. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on the reproductive health impacts. There are very, very clear links between adolescent relationship abuse and unintended pregnancy, just as there are very clear links, you know, with adults and intimate partner violence in general. Adolescent girls in physically abusive relationships are nearly twice as likely to become pregnant than girls who are not experiencing violence and abuse in their relationships. So think about adolescents in general, you know, they tend to already be the highest age group that's experiencing unplanned, unintended pregnancy. So when you look at the percentage that's experiencing violence and abuse, and then look at the unintended pregnancy rates, it's really, really high. And what we know about young people who experience pregnancy is that they're very likely to get pregnant again pretty soon, right? So keep that in mind. Pregnant adolescents are 2 to 3 times more likely to have experienced violence during and after their pregnancy than older women. And that we did talk about that a little bit this morning, just in terms of how connected these are. Susie was talking about that statistic, right? Adolescent mothers who experience physical abuse within 3 months after delivery were nearly twice as likely to have a repeat pregnancy within 2 years. And then in terms of sexual behaviors and high risk behaviors, we know that young people who are experiencing violence and abuse are much more likely to engage in sexual activity at a younger age, before 15 specifically. They're more likely to have multiple partners, as many as 4 or more. They're much more likely to use drugs and alcohol and other substances during sex, or just also in general, but before sex, it's a part of their sexual experience. And a lot of that could be coerced, and it can also be an effect of the violence and abuse, because the violence and abuse is, it's sort of I'm losing my train of thought. That we know that they're much more likely to use substances because of the violence and abuse. So it just becomes a part of. Yes, thank you. Losing my thought there for a second. And they're much more likely to have a current STI or have a history of STIs, and also have combined STIs at the same time. And then not use condoms consistently or correctly. This is talking specifically about condoms, but birth control is also a part of that. And then have partners that are high risk for HIV and other STIs. And what we know about STIs and HIV is that when you have an STI, you're much more at higher risk of getting HIV, and vice versa, right? They're interconnected as well. Aside from the health impacts and the reproductive health impacts, we know that those that are using harm are much more, those that are experiencing harm are much more likely to also carry weapons and engage in fights and bullying and other high-risk behaviors like that, specifically at school or within the community. And physical and sexual victimization is also associated with increased risk of just poor academic performance in general. As well as lying and theft and just being disconnected in that sense. So there's a lot of connection points here, and a lot of impact that's happening in all areas of their lives.
All right, so this right here is the program I was talking about, our Generation J Youth Initiative. And if you ever want us to come out, we can. We do a lot of different workshops around healthy relationships. We do school-based programming, so we're literally on campuses doing a curriculum-based program around these different topics. We do outreach and education, so we do a lot of different activities in the community for youth and their parents. Why is the parent component so important? Exactly, reinforcement. So we can talk to our youth and tell them all of these fantastic things, and they're like, oh, that's great, and then they go home, and what happens? Right? It's all out the window, right? Because the parents aren't reinforcing it. And then we do youth leadership training too. We have a high school youth leadership council that are trained to be peer-to-peer advocates to discuss healthy relationships with their classmates. All right. Ooh, what's going on? All right. I don't know what happened. It went all the way back to. Oh, okay.
So we are going to switch. We're going to switch gears and talk a little bit more in depth about reproductive coercion. So it sounds like you're all familiar with this term. Is it up? Okay. Well, we're going to go to the next slide. Yeah.
Across the board, or are you guys just one entity? You can only do so much.
So
because these kids be educated and their parents, and if they're not being educated in school, they're not gonna have any information and be just set up to be victimized.
Yeah, so there's several organizations that do go into schools. The problem is that it's very, very difficult to get into a school, especially LAUSD. Like we are in some very few LAUSD schools. The majority of the schools that we're able to get into are Catholic schools, believe it or not, and charter schools, and also in the Inglewood Unified School District. But LAUSD, it's very, very, very hard.
Doesn't LAUSD do abstinence only education?
You know what?
Not all schools.
Not
Okay.
all schools.
Okay, because that also plays a role. The schools that do abstinence only are very rigid in terms of the types of education that they welcome. And Planned Parenthood is definitely an organization that goes around. The ones that have solid partnerships with schools and school districts, they definitely do it. This used to be much more common, let's say like 5 to 10 years ago. It was easier to find
That's true.
programs that were going out, and a lot of those programs have dropped off and lost funding, and they're just not really. The school system has just gotten more rigid, I guess that's the best way to say it. So it's one thing to go in and talk about healthy sex. It's a whole other thing to go in and then talk about safe and healthy relationships. So it is needed. It might be easier to reach the parents at this point than to go into schools.
It's hard too because consistency, right? Like maybe you can go in, right, and do one session, and that's great. That's better than nothing. But what they really need is to be able to form a relationship with that school, with the kids, with the parents, so we can consistently come in and talk about this issue, right, and become a part of the community. And that's very, very hard.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Is that something that they like maybe us who have kids can go talk to the principal about, or the teachers?
That would be great because a lot of That would be great because a lot of principals have autonomy, right? So you don't necessarily have to wait for the MOU to go through LAUSD, which is like doggone near impossible. The principal can invite you onto your school. So yeah, if parents were to advocate for this type of education, that would make a huge difference as far as access.
Okay, so I'll just say I used to do this for many years. I was over at Harbor UCLA, and we had a very robust outreach program, and we were going to all the programs in the South Bay doing this type of education. We had a whole series of safer sex, health, nutrition, and adolescent relationship abuse that we were doing. And the parents were not always happy about it. So it's that there would be work there to do to engage the parents and help them understand why this is so important, because a lot of parents don't want these types of things discussed with their kids. So,
and then it's interesting too because she had that experience like in the South Bay, and I have like the opposite experience, just trying to get the parents engaged, right? It's doggone near impossible. Trying to let them even know what it is we're trying to do, right? So it's an interesting dynamic, depending on what community you serve.
We can go to the next slide. We've already talked about this, the connection between ARA and unintended pregnancy. About 25% of adolescent females report that their partner was trying to get them pregnant. So why does an adolescent, a young person, why are they trying to get somebody pregnant? Yeah.
So working with Jenesse Center, there was a phone call that came in years ago. There was a young man, he said that he's trying to get himself and his girlfriend into the shelter. She's pregnant, and they want to get to a shelter for Section 8. And I told him, well, we're a domestic violence agency. If she comes into the shelter, she'll have to report on you. You won't be together. There'll be a process. It'd be better off to find employment, build, my mom told me to get into a shelter. And I'm just like, this is what the parents are telling them. It's like, there's no support, no guidance. This is the easiest way to fix your situation. And then it also goes back into keeping a child under 18 under the roof to keep this money coming in. Those are the new avenues of sustainability in our society, in some societies now. And so this is part of it. And then on top of that, if there's a child involved, I'm forever in your life. And you can't get rid of me. So those, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, that's definitely a reason why lots of people want to have children. Exactly. What you said made me also think about why I keep losing my train of thought. I'll come back. Was there another question? Yes. To trap them, to practice more power and control, to keep them around. If you have a child with somebody, there is a lot of opportunity for power and control. What I was going to say, everything you're pointing out about the parents, where you might see experiences like this is really, really important to this conversation, because what we know is that most parents are doing the best they can, and they're living their life through their own experiences of trauma. And this is a really important conversation. It would need like a whole day to really dive into it, so I can't talk about it too much right now. But what happens to you as a kid affects you as a parent. It affects how you parent. It affects the way you interact with your kids, the way you show up, the way you respond to things. And then that's where the cycle is, right? So we need to stop and think about that. And it's good to, when you're working with young people, it needs to be maybe not a part of the conversation, but it needs to be recognized by you, the helper, the supporter, the person who's trying to connect them to services. Because what happens is a lot is judgment is easily passed and support isn't actually given where it's needed. Is the parents need just as much support as their kids do, if not more, right? Because that's really where a lot of it is starting, and a lot of it is learned, or they're exposed through what's happening to their parents. So I just wanted to point that out.
That's an excellent point, because we always talk about how that's an excellent point, because we always talk about you can't teach what you don't know, right? And like Jennifer says, a lot of parents are doing the best that they can, but because we see the effects, right? We tend to judge parents, or oftentimes we'll write off parents, right? But the parents are the problem. They're no good. I'm not even going to talk or engage with the parents. I'm just going to try to save the kid. When you can't save the kid, right? Without somehow getting the parent involved. So that's important to just remember.
Okay, moving on. Let's get back to reproductive coercion. So reproductive coercion it's basically defined the same as all the forms of violence that Angela already talked about. But it's specifically over reproductive health, fertility, and reproductive access, specifically. And the main, it's all rooted in power and control. So power and control over somebody's fertility, reproductive access, decisions that they make that affect their reproductive health, all those types of things. So some really concrete examples, and you maybe hear this in the work that you do, but explicit attempts to get somebody pregnant when they don't want to be. And there's lots of ways that can happen. Controlling the outcomes of a pregnancy, whether it's forced pregnancy or forced termination. Interfering with proper or regular use of contraception, including Plan B. Obviously coercive sex and coerced unprotected sex. And with that, it could also be coercive sex with multiple partners or sexual exploitation, and then also preventing access to birth control. So this is something that we see a lot. There's a couple quotes in here. It just illustrates it really well from a young person's perspective or their experience. Like the first couple of times, the condom seemed to break every time. You know what I mean? It was just kind of funny. Like the first 6 times the condoms broke. 6 condoms, that's kind of rare. I could understand 1, but 6 times. Then after that, I got on birth control, and he was just like always saying, like, you should have my baby, you should have my daughter, you should have my kid. So we know that condoms break every now and then, but they don't break every single time you use them. So that is a huge indicator, if you're talking to somebody, to ask about what is going on in the relationship, to ask about their how they feel, the power and control that they feel they have over their own decision making when it comes to things like birth control, for example. This is just an indicator, and this is where our role becomes really, really important, because there's so many little opportunities like this where we can intervene and offer support. And if you just kind of turn the other way or not really pay attention, or if you're just not really aware that this is even a thing, it's a missed opportunity, right? Can you guys think of other examples? We've heard it all. We've heard, you know, dumping the pills out and both ways, right? I've heard as extreme as somebody yanking the IUD out. And then, of course, just not even allowing somebody to send manipulation with young people and with adults. Yeah, just a lot to keep in mind there in terms of how it's all happening. And sometimes when we hear boyfriend doesn't think it's healthy, you know, there's a lot of manipulation that goes into that, where it could be easy for us to just say, just get yourself over there, right? If you don't really understand how that's all playing out and why they really do feel like they do not have the control to go and they don't have the access to go. Okay, so we're going to talk about how we promote prevention a little bit and how we respond in these different settings. Again, prevention is a really big conversation. And I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on intervention, but we are going to talk mainly about universal education. That's what the CUES intervention is, if you're not familiar with that. But I just want to highlight and emphasize some of the key points around prevention of adolescent relationship abuse. And this comes from the CDC's preventing IPV across the lifespan. They have a technical package for providers. So this might be something for you to look at if you are trying to implement more prevention strategies across the board. So I just want to point to that. You can go to the next slide. So I heard a lot of different settings in the introductions, but if we're talking specifically about healthcare and clinics, including school-based health centers, we know that ARA is rarely identified in those settings. And why do you think that is? Yeah.
It could be either that the person coming in doesn't recognize that they're being abused, or just they're ashamed. They're ashamed. They don't want to share, or they're going to get the person in trouble, or they can call my parents.
Mm-hmm.
All of that stuff.
Right. It kind of starts with like the don't ask, don't tell thing. So if providers, counselors, teachers, you know, whatever the role is, if you are not aware of how to identify it, and if you're not asking the right questions, if you're not bringing it up, they're not bringing it up. I mean, I think in rare cases they would bring it up and ask for help, but it's not typical that they're going to do that on their own. The door needs to be open for them. And typically it takes like 9 encounters with somebody who's experiencing violence and abuse before they actually disclose something. So keep that in mind, how much we have to be on their side and how much these conversations really matter. And it might be not 9 times with you specifically, but each provider, each support person that they're coming into contact with. You have a question?
A lot of times, these clinics are quote unquote youth friendly.
Yeah.
Or staff haven't been trained on how to
Mhm.
interact with young people.
Yeah.
And kids come there and they get turned off, and so they just leave,
Right.
you know.
So let's talk about that. I have a little bit of that in here, but how do we make our facilities and our centers youth friendly? Because that's really important. And you also need to be LGBT friendly and, you know, gender friendly, right? Otherwise people are not going to come to you, and the people in the community, they know which centers are safe and which centers are not. So what can we do? What are some, I mean, it doesn't take a whole lot. What are some simple things that you can shift or start doing that can bring that friendliness
Or what
and
you're
well,
already doing.
yes, or what are you, thank you. What are you already doing?
Cross
Mhm.
That's great.
Yep. Yep. You can just shout it out. Yeah.
Encourage them and empower them to have their own voice, so they choose, as a counselor, I let them choose when they want to share their story.
Mhm.
I always let them know that it's their healing journey, so when they're ready, they're able to express that and express their wants and needs, be assertive, so they know that they have a voice and not just adults telling them what to do.
Thank you. Anything else?
With the tech savvy youth, I think,
Yeah.
if there was a platform or more of a podcast where it's a live broadcast, bringing on, I mean, one of these topics, but not something that's live and you can only see it at that time, but something that's recorded and you can see it when you're safe,
Mhm.
you know? And that's another thing, is like, if there was more resources out there that are tangible 24 hours a day.
Mhm.
The clinic's closed, you know, school's closed. You need to be able to do it while you're in the loop. You know, you need to be able to do it when you're safe and able to take in the information and retain it and have retention versus
Mhm.
trying to get it in piecemeal,
Right.
trying to apply it to your life.
So like an app.
Apps are good, but apps also can be watchstars.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, you gotta make sure they have safety.
Yeah.
It wouldn't say like domestic violence.
Mhm.
By this
I
dress.
think more like like I said, a podcast. Even if there was a talk show that addressed this every day, not along with whatever else, but just always encourage people to watch your reflection and then notice the changes in yourself and apply and correct it.
Mhm.
Don't let it fester.
Mhm. And the same way we work so hard to be survivor centered, we can use those principles to be adolescent centered, adolescent informed. So we want to engage them in the strategy that we take on to better accommodate them and fit their needs and be able to support them as best as possible. There's so many ways that programs around the country are being more adolescent friendly. A big part is training, because you need to communicate, I'm going to say the right way, right? You need to communicate the right way. And there might be a different way to communicate with young people than with adults. And it varies in the geographical areas that you're all serving in, right? So just think about that. And the resources that you offer is another really big one. So if there's any way at all that you can engage them in the process and find out how they get information and then offer the information that way. And that's going to vary depending on where you're at in LA. And then for those of you that are in different parts of the state or nationally, it varies. But do that. Find out how they get the information and do that, whatever that is.
I also wanted to say just right quick that I loved hearing so many people doing peer-to-peer advocacy, because in my it's been very effective, right? In what I've seen, and also creating a space for youth, right? Have a space where they can come. That's the teen or the youth room, right? Where they feel comfortable, and you don't have to have programming there. You don't even have to be talking about domestic violence or whatever. It's just a safe space, so they start associating, right? Safety, like with your organization.
And I apologize. We got like 10 minutes and we have so much information to cover. So I'm gonna zip through as much as I can, but I want this to be as useful as possible to you. And we really appreciate the engaging and the questions and all of that. Some of the pieces I'm going to get into is also going to talk about how we can be more teen friendly, if I could say it that way. We know that there are reasons why people don't talk about not violence and abuse. We want to shift our language in these conversations. Why people don't talk about safe and healthy relationships. We want to start framing it that way in our conversations with young people. Some of the big ones that we hear are, it is beyond my scope of work because I am trained to do this. I don't provide DV services, right? So think about that, how that relates to your setting. This is where partnerships come into play. And this is where cross-training can be so valuable. You don't need to be the expert to be of support and to be able to connect people to the right support. So think about that. A lot of people are unaware of just how common adolescent relationship abuse actually is and the impacts that it actually has. They might just think of it in terms of the the violence and the injuries that are occurring, but they're not thinking about that whole other world of health impacts that are happening, as well as academic impacts, behavioral impacts, and how that's going to carry out across their lifespan if it is not stopped at some point. A lot of people are very uncomfortable initiating these conversations, and they're uncomfortable talking about sex, and they're uncomfortable talking about sexual behaviors. And you can't talk about both. This is where you all move past and figure out how to get comfortable enough to have the conversation, right? They talked about that a little bit this morning. It's not about how you feel. It's about able to provide access to what survivors need. And that access is even harder with young people. So we need to think more strategically about how we're able to support. And again, this is where your partnerships help us to get more comfortable, because you in talking about this when you have a partner that you know and that you trust, that kind of supports you in doing your job, right? We're also going to talk about cues. Hopefully, that's why I'm trying to rush so we can get to this intervention, but it is a very easy plug and play, evidence-based conversation system. It's basically like, follow this script, and this will help you get comfortable having these conversations in a way that's really, really effective. People are unsure about what to do or say. If somebody does disclose abuse, that's all about the response that's built into the policies and the practices of the organizations that you work with. Worrying about mandatory reporting is another really big one. And mandatory reporting for young people is a whole other, it's a lot more complicated than with adults, right? So I don't want to undermine that, but we always like to focus more on if we can reframe to mandatory supporting over mandatory reporting, you can do more good than focusing on the report, right? Obviously, there are cases when, yes, you have to make the report. There's no way around it, especially with young people. Not being so adolescent focused or adolescent friendly, and then not having time. So the cues intervention does resolve a lot of these barriers that programs and providers are already experiencing. And this is why I say it's kind of a plug and play solution to a lot of this. I want you to think for a second in your setting or in the relationships that you have with young people and the conversations that you're having with them. What if disclosure and identification of abuse was no longer the goal? That's not why you're talking to them, to get them to share something with you, to get them to disclose. Can you even imagine that? That's not the goal of these conversations.
Are to lay out the tools for a foundation so that you can grow something on top of that. It's like anything can happen once the proper foundation is set. But if you're trying to get to a goal, once you say goal, you feel your job is done. So
yeah,
your goal will always be moving.
Right. And if I could package all of what you just said in one word, I would say support, right? But all of that he laid out, and that trust and rapport and relationship building is so critical when it comes to young people. I know. I know. Are you all okay if we go just like a few minutes over? I know we got to head back in. That it starts at 2:10 in there. If you do need to leave or use the bathroom or something, please go ahead. But I want to be able to get through the cues. But I want you to just think about this. Instead of framing the conversation with young people as what happened to you, let's try to shift that to where do you want to go and how can I help you get there? How can I support you? And we, really shifting from what is wrong with you. And this kind of goes back to our conversations about the parents, right? And kind of reframing how we see young people and how we see their experiences, that it's a lot of it, it's not their fault. It's just the conditions that they were brought up in. let's just keep going because I want to get to the most important stuff. This is just, some of you already commented on some of the reasons why young people might not disclose. So this is just pointing some of those things out. There's a lot of reasons why people do not disclose. Again, you'll get these slides, so you can spend a little more time with this, but I think you're all pretty familiar with this. We do want to think about the ways that our conversations are building trust and promoting safety, but also our structures and our offices and our buildings that young people are walking into. And we healthy relationships. That's really, really important. And displaying the right material is a really big difference and starts the conversation before you even sit across from them. Buildings, your bathrooms, the stalls, the ceilings when they're getting their PAP exams, they can all contribute to and promoting prevention and your work is. Of course, you want to acknowledge violence relationships on any intake counseling forms, documentation that you're already doing. You want to make sure that that's a part of it. This is the bathroom at a school-based health center, and safer for people to take information. So there are these safety cards up here, the Futures Without Violence cards. I'm going to be focusing specifically on the I think it's this one, hanging out or hooking up card. These are wallet size. We call them safety cards. They're meant to be discreet. They have a bunch of panels on there. This is like all the work and the script and the thinking around how to have these conversations is built into this. This isn't something that you read, but it's a prompt for you. It's also a resource to give to people if it's safe for them to take with them. And they do come in multiple languages, and actually you are free to take what's here. And the DPH exhibitor table their table is filled with all of different types of safety cards, different topics. You can also order them for free through Futures Without Violence. You just pay like $10 for shipping. You can also download them, and 15, it went up. Okay. Went up since COVID. $15 for 2,000 of them. So you can also download them and localize, that was the word I was looking for, localize the resources that are on the back for your organization or for your specific community. And these are just some others, LGBT, focusing on LGBT community, trans and gender non-conforming communities, and then also one that's focusing on Muslim youth. So we've talked a lot about how important your role is in promoting safe and healthy relationships. I'm just speeding through a few. Okay. We've talked a lot about how to lean on your partners and why partnerships are so important. So let's move to universal education. So again, this is something that can be done with what you're already doing. It doesn't need to, it's not going to replace like any type of formal screening or assessment that you're already doing. It's going to complement the assessment that you're doing. So it might be, instead of like, checkbox kind of questions, which are not effective and people close off to them and you're always going to get a no, no, no. This is just the actual, like a meaningful, transformative conversation that you can have. And it's an opportunity to reach survivors who are not going to disclose to you. It's also prevention. Especially when you're doing this at every interaction and when all staff is trained to have these conversations, it's an opportunity to reach people who maybe are not experiencing violence and abuse because they're getting that anticipatory guidance about supporting them in the specific ways that they need as well. It helps create a safe and welcoming space, again, to talk specifically about safe and healthy relationships. And it's really going to help us not have so many missed opportunities in our interactions, in our intake, in our counseling, in the classes, whatever those encounters are, however they look. You can also integrate them if you do group work. It can be integrated in group work, but you want to make sure there is private one-on-one conversations in safe areas where, if things are coming up for people. We know that survivors, they want you to ask about their relationships. They want the people that they're seeing to ask about their relationships. Don't you like talking about your relationships? I think everybody likes talking about themselves and likes talking about their relationships, in general. So it's one of those things, if you're not asking people, they're not going to tell you, but they really appreciate it, especially the ones that are struggling, the ones that are hurting, and the ones that are experiencing so much trauma. There is no harm in asking, and this has been well documented and tested. You're not causing harm by asking questions about people's relationships unless you're asking them in a non-trauma informed way. And we know that these interventions are very effective and they have direct impacts on people's health and safety outcomes. Okay, so CUES stands for confidentiality, universal education and empowerment, and support, and all the pieces that we lean on for support. First and foremost, confidentiality. I'm just going to breeze over this. I'm assuming if you work with young people, you got this down packed, how to talk about confidentiality, but we never want to talk about safe and healthy relationships without making sure that they know the limits to your confidentiality before those conversations happen. Otherwise, you are breaching all that trust in that moment when you say, this is one of those times when I have to share this information, right? So you want them to be really clear going in, that they understand, and you want to use language that is young people friendly, right? Before we get started, I want you to know that everything we talk about here is confidential. Not all young people know what confidential means, so spell that out. We don't want to say secret. That has a lot of negative connotations. But what that means is I won't talk to anyone else, or I won't share this information with anyone else unless, that's the key word you need to have in your script, unless you tell me that you're being hurt physically or sexually by someone, or planning to hurt yourself or others. This is very specific. We used to say, unless somebody is hurting you or you're thinking of hurting yourself. Hurting has a lot of different meanings and definitions. Young people would think of like, well, I smoke and that's hurting myself, so I'm not going to tell you that I smoke, right? We want to be very explicit about what we're talking about. So when it comes up, they know that it means you need to essentially break confidentiality. And how to do this when you're building rapport. Your story is your own, and I don't want you to feel like you have to share anything to get support. If a young person tells me X, Y, and Z, fill in the blank, then I have to get others involved to make sure that you're safe. So there's very simple, gentle tweaks that we can make to our language that make a really big difference in these conversations with young people. Then when we move into the universal education piece, this is where we're going to introduce the card. Melody, can you be my helper? Can you pass this card out to everybody? Yeah. That way you guys can see some of the scripts that are in there. But one of the best ways to introduce this card is to normalize the conversation and start with something like, because so many of the young people that I work with experience harm in their relationships or experience violence and abuse and whatever the word is that you want to use. Because this is so common and so many of the young people I work with experience this, I started talking to all my clients about this, or all my students about this, or all my patients about this. Again, insert the language that works for your setting. Then you open the card, and a really effective way to introduce this with the young people is to say it's kind of like a quiz in a magazine. You know, it talks about safe and healthy relationships. It gives you different scenarios. You can kind of like, check the boxes that apply to you, right? Then what I suggest for you is to get really familiar with the card that would be the most useful to you, and it might be multiple. Pick one or two examples that are in there. And if you really around reproductive, move to that panel, which can the person that you're seeing, can you talk to the person that you're seeing about how far you want to go sexually? Or do you feel like you have control to make decisions around birth control, right? You can pick one or two that are the most relevant for your work and for the person that you're talking to. And then you want to help make the connection. You want to watch their reaction, watch how they're holding their body or how their body movements are changing. That's going to give you a lot of information. And a simple way to make that connection, is this happening in your relationship? Does this sound like your story? Can you relate to this? And then just listen and see what they say. And they might not say anything. The other thing that we know is a lot of people will talk about their friends. And that might be a way that they're asking for support, or it might actually be because their friends are experiencing this, right? So the other thing that we do is we always give out 2 cards, not 1. And that's so that you have support if you ever need it, and you can help a friend. And we know that when you can support somebody as a survivor, it's actually part of your healing, and it supports that journey for you when you can be of support to somebody else. So that's really it. It really doesn't take a long time. It might feel a little bit awkward and scripted in the beginning, and this is where you just need to get familiar with the cards. And it's really just reframing the conversations. That's all it is. It can be as quick as 30 seconds. It doesn't have to take a whole lot of time in your interactions. We are way over. There are some response, really important response steps in here if you do get a disclosure, and then just some support pieces in terms of how you respond. But the biggest thing is make sure you're addressing the reason they came in to see you in the first place, and then do all the harm reduction that they need that's relevant for them, and lean on your partners to do everything that you cannot do. And you want to have DV people in your corner that are the experts in offering that type of support to young people. Let them do that work if that's not really what your role is. And I'm not speaking to the DV service providers in the room when I say that. For the DV service providers in the room, you want to be able to have those reproductive health people and the healthcare providers that are teen friendly, the pediatricians in your corner, so you can connect them so they can get safe, confidential services that they need. So I'm so sorry this is so rushed. I'm going to you guys will get all of these slides, I promise. The resources are in here. This is the link to, I'm looking at my slides and not yours. You guys will have the link to be able to access the cards. Please take all of these. We can pop up our information. IPVhealth.org is another, it's an online tool that Futures Without Violence has that's really helpful in terms of how we can build partnerships and how to implement your role as a DV partner or a healthcare partner. And our emails. I'm so sorry this was so rushed, but I hope this was helpful.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We can be here for like a minute if anybody has any other questions. And I definitely have to get back into that room, but
Thank you.